webinar. V8 is Kony's latest release, and it's a big one. If you are an existing customer, Kony V8 is not just another upgrade with minor improvements and bug fixes. Instead, it's a reimagining of how Visualizer and Fabric work together and separately, allowing you to create apps faster and more seamlessly than ever before across native and the web. So we welcome Luis Landivar. He's the host of the session. He's the host of the webinar today. He's Kony Director of Digital Architecture, and he's the presenter. We also have Faizan Khalidi. Um, he's Kony Senior Product Manager, and he's also on call to answer all the questions that you might have. If you have questions during the webinar, please make sure that you use the Q&A panel. Do not use the chat panel instead. Use the Q&A panel and put your questions. We'll answer them by the end of the session. We are also recording this webinar, and we'll post it on the Basecamp as a resource, so you guys can later on go to Basecamp, use the recording or share with your friends and anyone you want to share it with. We also have a couple of polls. We'll put it up during the event, and you can participate and contribute in that. So let's start the presentation. Over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Tame. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody around the world joining us today for this webinar. We're going to review the Kony version 8 features. This is a great release, and we've done a lot of improvements and enhancements to the platform, and we're excited to share them with you. What I'll go ahead and start with is our Kony mission. It's something that is important for everybody to know what we're here at Kony doing every day, and that is enabling our customers to deliver omni-channel digital experiences, exceptional user experiences in a secure way and in an affordable way. And we help them to do that in this particular release across a wide variety of sections and enhancements in different components. One of them is the component in the marketplace, which is a brand new section that allows you to share and reuse components, user experience items, collections of screens, collections of widgets. And we also have enhanced the way that those components are created, the way that those components are shared, to include business logic, to include a property-based user interface to configure those objects, so you don't have to necessarily drop into code in order to see that, but rather you can just select a configuration option and take advantage of the component capability. We've added data adapters to different systems, including IBM MQ, and we also give you the ability to have your own private marketplace. So within your enterprise or within your company, you can have a marketplace of components that could be reused across projects that is not necessarily available to the public, so you can keep all that within your enterprise. We're also focused on rapid app creation, making sure that we enable developers to quickly deliver solutions to create apps faster. The integration of Visualizer Starter with Fabric, it's now there. You can now use Visualizer Starter, which is our free version, and Kony Fabric together, and that's very powerful. There's a lot of productivity feature enhancements around the masters, which is the reuse of components across different channels, like the mobile phone, the tablet, the desktop, or web type of components. Enhancements around the app wizard. When you're creating a project, it guides you through what type of project do you want to create, what kind of app are you building. Enhancements to the way you preview applications as you're building them. And there's also a very powerful visual object mapper in Kony Fabric that allows you to map the different objects to the services that you're configuring at the API management layer. And there's also great improvement in the DevOps space with continuous integration, automated build, automated testing, and many other features. We did invest in the developer productivity at the full stack level, allowing you to automate more processes, automate the entire software development lifecycle for build, for testing, and for continuous integration, integrating to the systems like Jenkins and GitHub, and providing you with an end-to-end automated cycle. We also have included health checks for services. You can make sure that those services that you have configured in Kony Fabric continue to run. and are running up consistently and healthy, and then you can take action based on the results from the test. Docker, we're offering support now for Docker, and we do have Azure hosting certification for those who are on the Microsoft Azure cloud. As you all know, the Kony cloud is based out of AWS, but Kony Fabric, it's supported on both on AWS, or Azure, or on any other cloud for that matter. And then another focus improvement is in the future app experiences around Android Wear, the watch, support for wearables. There's enhancements to the APIs and to the way you consume native APIs that are available directly from the operating system. Universal binaries for iOS or for Android, whether you want the same app to run on the tablet or on the phone, it's supported. There's some iOS 11 specific features as well that are available, like dragging content from an outside app into an app right within the home panel. And there's also enhancements to the way that we do our single page architecture for web, and some security enhancements around OAuth providers, giving you the ability to create to have Kony Fabric become your custom OAuth provider to standardize the way users, developers authenticate. And also, and this is a number of some of the improvements we've had. For a full list, you can always visit our website and at the product screens for Visualizer and Kony Fabric and get a detail of everything that is new. And one of the latest things, you'll see API management is one of the areas where we have significantly invested in and enhanced. There's also an API developer portal. This helps you create a live documentation that's evergreen, that's always based on the current configuration of the APIs that have been configured, and then you can expose that to your internal developers, or if you're like a systems integrator, or if you're building your own solutions and then you're exporting and you need to export those APIs for others to consume, you can then expose those APIs to the developer portal as well. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and dive in right into what the Kony platform is. For those who may be new to Kony and are joining this webinar for the first time learning about Kony, let me go through briefly what the Kony platform is made out of. On the client side, this is creating the user interfaces, the user experience, and the omni-channel design for tablets, desktops, wearables, kiosks, whether you're building chatbots or integration through different user interfaces. You can do that through Kony Visualizer, and you can do that in a visual way. It's a visual designer. You see exactly what you're creating in the canvas as you drag and drop the widgets, which enables and allows you to do low-code development. All the widgets are placed on the canvas, and then you can tie them with Action Editor. You can leverage the Kony APIs, which is our Omni-channel API framework that lets you, using a single code base that is JavaScript-based, create applications across the different channels and supporting the different operating systems. It also gives you access to those native APIs. If there's any API that is made available by the operating system that is not part of a cross-platform API, you can still have easy access to them through the native function interfaces. And then we also have the hybrid web framework support if you wanted to add your own HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and run those components within a web view within the application, or even if you wanted to bring in a Cordova project into Kony Visualizer so you can standardize in the approach in which you deliver and create applications, you can do that as well and leverage that capability. That's on the client side. Then on the server side, on the services, this is where we have Kony Fabric. This is where you'll find object services, in which we'll get into more detail in a moment, since that's one of the areas where we have significantly improved and enhanced on Kony V8. There's also the API management capabilities that we'll talk about, and where we have enhanced significantly the way that you can configure those APIs, the way you can test them, the way you can share the documentation around them, and create that live catalog that helps developers build applications. Integration adapters, that's the area where we have the integration adapters that allow you to connect easily and in a standard way that is also a secure way into those backend systems, whether it's an Oracle database or a web service, SOAP, REST, XML, or whether it's Salesforce, you name it. We have a number of adapters. And then the analytics layer that lets us collect all the information from the client side, from developers, or for developers, or for the business to decide, what do I do next with my application? How are users using this application? And there's also a wide variety of backend services, and we'll be happy to share them as well. You can contact us directly. We'll do a demonstration that's specific around Kony Fabric, and we can go into a much deeper level of that as well. And Kony Fabric also enables you to use client SDKs for native iOS, on Android Studio, on Xcode, or on Android Studio for Android. If you want to develop native apps and leverage the services provided by Kony Fabric, you can use our SDKs. And this is the area, the layer that connects and unlocks the data that is contained within those enterprise systems, whether it's your retail systems, campaign systems, or push notifications, databases, content management, or web services. Any type of backend service is then connected, secured, and exposed in a secure way through the REST or through the digital world to be accessed from the different devices and screens that you see here in the Omni-channel framework. Add to that the Kony Marketplace, the ability to reuse and import fully developed applications, in some cases, collections of user interface components, or even business logic, maybe data models, backend services, a data adapter. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Leverage the marketplace. We'll also welcome anybody who wants to share, and we're more than happy to take whatever you want to share and include it in the marketplace as well, going through our vetting process. So now as we go into the Kony App Platform, these are the three sections on V8, on version 8, that we're going to focus on. How we simplify business to employee development, how we simplify the development of amazing user experiences for your consumers, and the type of experiences that you expect in an omni-channel solution for your consumers. The simplified development for, and this really applies to both business to employees and business to consumer. But one of the things, Kony, we want to help you with is to start fast and to stay fast. And you don't have to compromise the extensibility or the security in doing so. You're able to take end-to-end templates that are available in the marketplace. As you can see some of them here, they're very well documented. There's a comprehensive list of components in there if you go and visit the Kony Marketplace. For those of our customers who are in the banking, we are also providing a banking-specific marketplace that will have connectors, adapters specifically to the financial services world. And it includes all the data connectors as well as different functions and features like a chatbot that's already pre-built that you can use within your project. Here's an example as I walk you through the enhancements in version 8 of a B2E, a business to employee type of application that we're going to use and show you how is it that the version 8 enables you to build such application using the components that are reusable, using the object services layer, and the API management capabilities of Kony Fabric. Here's a simple app, a login screen, a directory service, and then a menu that is typically needed within an app that gives you many options. So let me show you first the visual aspects and the integration with the Kony Marketplace. As you can see here on the left, there's a wide variety of components. Those components have been imported from the Kony Marketplace. Right within the development environment, within Kony Visualizer, you can open the marketplace, explore the components that are available there, view the details, view the documentation that walks you and tells you specifically about that component, what you need to do, about how you need to integrate it, what components you need to bring in, what settings you can set, and then define where it is that you want to import. And at that moment, you can select a collection library, and it will import it right into Kony Visualizer. within the project that you have at the forefront of your workspace. At that point, then you can start dragging and dropping the components into the canvas, and it will automatically include everything that comes with that component. Notice how we have the ability there to enable Touch ID, for example, with a simple property. You don't have to do this in code. Enable social login, or if you want to enable login through Facebook, for example, and password input, the logo. You can configure this component and make it yours. And it can turn on and off those modules that include modules like that include code, like I mentioned earlier with Touch ID. But in this case, instead of using the code, you can simply set it as a property that gets defined in the action editor. Notice also the custom events. Each one of these components can have a custom event that can trigger a particular logic. So you don't necessarily have to go based on the generic events, but you can use those custom events that were created for that specific component to then use our low-code action editor to specify the logic and build that action of what happens next. In this case, what we did there was go to the next screen. So what we're doing now is running the project, and you can see on the right Kony Visualizer functional preview application, and you can see how we can then quickly preview the prototype that we're building, the application that we're building. Remember in Kony, when I say prototype and visualizer, that could start as a prototype, but that project itself becomes the final product, the application. It's not a matter of having to recreate everything that you just did within the project. And an enhancement in the local and functional preview application is also the ability to connect through USB. So if you don't have a Wi-Fi connection, you can now select USB, and you can connect directly to the visualizer to retrieve that prototype and view it. Here's another example of the type of pass-through component and properties. In this case, the dictionary is being turned off. The dictionary, for those who may not have noticed, is the ability to, within a directory, to select like A, B, C, D, organized by letter. And now, as you can see, the dictionary was turned off, so it's no longer visible here on the right side of the panel. So here's an example of how we allow you to start fast, leveraging those components from the marketplace, and how to stay fast by continuing to improve on those components and not be bogged down with the maintenance of them. Now we're going to talk about the API reusable models. Okay. Here's an example of, on the Kony Fabric side, when we talk about object services, when we talk about that layer of abstraction that we provide with our reference architecture, we talked about the ability to create an API model that is specific to your client app. And this could be a mobile app, it could be a tablet, it could be a desktop app or a web app for mobile devices, any of the outputs that we support. You create that data model, define what an employee looks like to this application, what a location is, and what a contact, what a department is. And then you have the built-in storage that's also provided as part of Kony Fabric when you're running on the cloud that allows you to create stubbed data, right? You don't have to wait for that line of business systems to be ready, for the APIs to be ready or for the system to be implemented. You can start developing your application and leverage the storage on the cloud. And you can either keep it there, excuse me, or you can then repoint later on whenever that business system is implemented, and all you have to do is just a matter of remapping that to the API model that your client has, which is the same as you see here in this case. But then you can map it to your business system, and that may look different, right? For an HR system, for example, an employee may be different than what you see in, or like in an Oracle HR system than what you see in a Salesforce system. Or the way that it's implemented, maybe an employee, you're keeping your profile employee pictures in a different system, in a content management system, but you're keeping the HR information around your personal information like address and phone number, contact information, emergency information, all of that in a different system. So here, through mapping, you can define what does an employee mean to me based on my backend system without having to redo all the code that you've done here on the client side. And this mapping provides that powerful decoupling so that you can take advantage of the configurability that you get with Kony Fabric. And that way you're not tied into that backend system in a way that becomes really difficult to change. So here, let's take a look at this video. And we're going to build an app, going to the marketplace. We're going to look at, here you can see all the different categories of components that you'll find, but we'll work with an employee data model. So we're going to import a data model into Kony Fabric, and this is the employee data model. So if you want to build an app that is employee related, you don't have to build your own data schema and model. There's already one available in the marketplace. You can leverage that. And this applies to any data model, regardless of what application you're building. You can build that data model, or you can use an existing one from the marketplace. Once we have the data model imported, we can now start going and looking at the configurations in Kony Fabric. So we go and look at the objects section of the Kony Fabric configuration, and we can see the data model now has the contact, department, employee, location, all the different objects. And then there's a mapping section. The first thing we do is publish that configuration to the runtime, the Kony Fabric runtime. What this does is it creates a schema on that storage cloud. Remember I mentioned the stub section that is running on the Kony Fabric storage services? And it's going to create a schema, which is now going to let us store information there, save data. So we go into the object services section. We can import data. It's a CSV, comma separated values. We import the schema, and all of the data then is imported and loaded based on that employee schema. Then we can select an operation, like an employee, and this is the area where you can test the service. In this case, this is an object services. It's based on the employee service. Once we query it, we get all the information back that comes back in the response. Okay, so we go back now into our configuration, and we're going to, you see how the endpoint type was set as storage? We're going to clone. We're going to create a different app data model, but we're going to base that one not on a storage, but rather on a relational database. So now, instead of pointing to the storage service, we're going to point this configuration to a database, a relational database. If we had any authentication identity providers, we can define that there as well. In this case, we're going to leave them as is. We'll demonstrate that in a little bit ahead. And now we can start doing the mapping. Now we can do mapping of the object. In this case, we're going to work with the employee object and select the table that we want to map that to. Once we map it to the data, to the table that makes sense, we can define then the verb that is used to access that data. In this case, the verb, notice, is the get, right? And we have get, put, patch, all the standard verbs that are available in REST services. These integration points that you see here at the object level are exposed as REST services. So that's the standard for mobile, and it's in a way that it makes it efficient. So now let's go ahead and test that and see, okay, let's map the information. I mentioned an enhancement in the data mapper. This is an example of the data mapper where we have the data that is based on the model and on the integration on the backend system that you see right here, employees.employees. And then here we have our employee data model that we exported. So we're mapping here, saying from that service call, we want to map the first name to the first name of this object, the last name to the last name of this object, and the zip to the location ID. Now notice also on the left the toolbox. There's a wide variety of tools available to you, so you can perform data transformation at this layer, at the binding layer. And you don't have to do this yourself in code. You can do it here in Kony Fabric through this configuration console. Once you save this, now we can test it. We're going to send, so we can retrieve the response. And notice there were 3 fields that were mapped to the object. So now when we get the employee object back, we get those 3 fields. We go ahead and we republish this component now, and this is how easy it is to publish this configuration. You select the environment. You can have multiple environments available there. you publish. If you wanted to change the endpoint, then you can select the configure and publish option, and that will let you change the endpoint, say if you're moving from a development to a test to a production environment. Now we can access the runtime console right from there and go into the object services. A new feature I mentioned was the ability to schedule health checks. Here's an example of how now directly from that same console we can go into the job section and define this job to perform a health check on the service that we just created. So we defined the service type, in this case is an object service type, we give it a name and even a version of the service that we want to test. There may be multiple versions of the service that we've configured that we want to test, and we can keep those health checks running separately. We can define the security level based on what the integration service uses, and then we can specify, you know, what kind of authentication is it required, what kind of history do we want to keep track of this health check, and how long do we keep this for. And then an email notification can be sent out to your choice of who, right? All account owners for this cloud account, a specific user list, or anybody who has access to the account, for example. So we provide a description here to check the health, describe so that somebody, when they come in, they can see and they can understand what this health check is for. And here we define what is it that we're looking for in the health check. So we call the web service returns a response. We see in this case that it returns the first name, the last name, and the location ID, with the location ID in the zip code, 32819. So what we're going to say is, okay, the job success criteria then is to search for this string. Notice how it says one match found, which means that a match that is successful. So we're going to test and see, we know that it's going to return 32819. We're going to change that, the success criteria, to say it has to return 32819 AAA. And this is to validate, to cause, right, the job to fail so you can see what happens. In this case, when they tested it, there were no matches found. So we now see that the response is not going to match, so it's going to result in a failure. So once we save the job, we can now see it and see the configuration defined in there. Here we tested it, and notice how it says fail now. Now we go and look into the job history, and we can see what came back. We can see the request headers, we can see the request body, we can see response headers and the response body. And in there now, we can look and see that, let me go back here, we can see that based on what the results from that health check was, we can see that the success criteria was 32819 AAA, which was not found in this response. So what it'll do then is it will send an email to those who were configured to receive the email notification about the failure of the job. So now let's take a look at what that email looks like. Here's an example where it tells you, gives you the account cloud, the service, the runtime, the environment where it was. It gives you all the details of the job and that failed, and the response body, everything that you found, including the criteria, what was the search string that was being looked for. So that way you can be aware of when your services may be experiencing some issue. So that's when it comes into a few examples of the new features that are available. Very powerful, allowing you to make sure that you're aware of the availability of your systems, allowing you to use object services in order to create those integration points that help you abstract the backend from the front end. Another aspect of improvements in Kony Fabric and in Kony version 8, both Fabric and Visualizer, include the simplified development of great user experiences. We do have a lot of interaction templates available. You can download them. When you download Visualizer 8, they are already included in there in the library section. There's a wide number of different components, from headers, footers, that you can use, and it gives you, again, with the power of a native user experience that you get only with a cross-platform platform like Kony. These are native components. They render and run natively, and it's not an HTML5 widget that is running on your app. And that's a big differentiator for those who are building apps in Kony. We don't have we're not forced to run hybrid applications in order to provide that cross-platform, although we do support that as well. So many of our customers choose to do native development with Kony instead of building hybrid apps because the level of effort is simplified. So here are the components I mentioned earlier. And this is an example of how we can build an app leveraging those components from the cloud, from the marketplace, which, by the way, right, it's running on the cloud. And look at all the different options. You can preview, like this is a range slider. You can preview, you can even see how many people are using it, how many people have downloaded, and you can like it. It's like a social environment network for you to share and show which components really mean and bring the most value to you. And this is great. We'll ask you to participate in there. If you're using a component, go there, make sure you like it, make sure you support that. That way we'll know what kind of components our customers are looking for. So what we'll do here is you'll see there's a different listing of components that have been built, a component directory for the employee example that we're working on, subheaders, views for retail type of scenarios, or maybe just for lists, and buttons. Notice how we have grouped also entry fields for address. So you can have an address 1, address 2, zip code, city, state, country, and all of that you don't have to be doing over and over again. There's footers, there's toolbars, headers, and all of it also following the standards from a user and theming perspective for each one of the operating systems. So here, let's then start dragging and dropping the components into the canvas to build a pipeline manager type of application that will include some nice graphics. We do have charts as well that are part of this library that comes with Kony Visualizer. Here's an example of the chart that will show us the amount of sales, for example, based on the different opportunities in this particular scenario. And then we drag and drop a foreground content. Notice that one of the components we imported within the Kony Visualizer marketplace was a parallax effect. And that parallax effect is achieved by combining these two components, as you saw, so that when we run the application, then you can start seeing that bounce and the parallax effect of the way that the screen loads. Here you'll see it on the right in Kony Visualizer, a functional preview app. You can see the app that we just built. We're running, it runs smoothly. It has the same effect as you would expect in a native application because it is running natively. Under the hood, it's connecting to the operating system and saying, render these charts or render these components. Now, there's also a lot of HTML-based charts that are available out there. You can use those as well. And some of those look very nice as well. So you're not really limited as to what type of frameworks you can bring in and leverage within your project. Here's another example of how, with the V8 features and the component reusability in the marketplace, we're enabling you to create applications that give you great user experience. Typically, in effect, something as simple like as an accordion for the different rectangles of components that you see here, it's something that you would have to write a fairly large amount of code to handle, at what point does it need to fold, make a transformation, an animation, 3D transformation. So it can get complicated, but you don't have to do all of that every time. Once you've done it once, and we'll continue to add more of these type of effects to the marketplace as well, you can componentize it and use it, okay? Here's an example for one of our examples of the apps that we've created, in which we're going to be dragging the different components and give it a title bar, with the usual home and other options, search text box with the ability to scan for a barcode. And all of that, by the way, a barcode scanner could be configured through the NFI and binding in the third-party libraries. There's a lot of this. There's Zebra, there's different other libraries for barcode scanning that sometimes come part of the actual hardware, the scanner hardware that you might have included. Then we're dragging the other components. In this case, we're adding the widgets that are going to make up the section where offers are listed, where products are listed by category. So here are some ideas, and this particular app is around a retail store and helping users get ideas that will then result in them going to the store and buying products, and which will result in more business and more revenue for this customer. Notice here, then, as we create the design, and this is a container for advertisement. Now let's go ahead and run this on the functional preview application so that you can see what it looks like. Once the build happens, we connect to Kony Visualizer functional preview, and notice the scrolling. It's scrolling normal. Each one of the panels are not necessarily folding. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see how the componentized version of that behavior to fold makes it a lot easier now with components, which are part of version 8. Let's go ahead and now make that change and go into the properties. We go into the property section of the component, and we select the accordion enabled and turn that on. That accordion effect will then start to be shown. We run the local preview again, and as we scroll through, you now see that accordion effect in each one of the panels. Notice the performance, notice how fast they move, and how smooth, and how quickly, just with the selection of that property to enable that, we were able to implement that type of behavior within the application. All right, here's an example of how these components can be extended. We provide the ability to manage those properties, as you saw in the previous screen, where we were managing whether we wanted to turn that accordion on or off. We can also define the property types, and some, for example, properties may be HTML-based, other ones may be specific to a component, like a list selector or a calendar, and then you can configure that and define the value and specify if that's a read or a write type of property. And then you'll be reading those inputs from the property section, and when the component runs at runtime within the application itself, then it'll take those inputs and it'll perform in the way that it's expected to. This is a great way to make a lot of these components available in that low-code environment, so for reusability, as well as allowing those developers who have the skills to create these components to also do that as well and extend it as needed. We also have a great omni-channel experiences. As I mentioned, that's another item we needed to point out. I wanted to point out the B2E and now B2C, business to consumer type of apps, which are apps that consumers have high expectations for. Consumers are used to using the Facebook app, the Snapchat, Instagram, your news app, and you name it. So you want to make sure you provide your users with that amazing user experience as well. And for B2C scenarios, you can also take advantage of the scalability that Kony Fabric gives you as you grow and reach the number of users, higher number of users, from thousands to perhaps hundreds of thousands to millions, as many of our banking customers do. Talking about our banking customers, here's an example of omni-channel experience in banking, where we have the different type of channels covered, right? We have mobile. You can see the different components here. As part of this is a retail banking application with the different components, including the bank bot. So all those user experiences are the ones that our customers expect and the ones that we enable you to deliver digitally, whether you're doing it on the phone. As you can see here in the visualizer section, these are the forms that we built on the mobile channel. We can do the same thing on the tablet channel. We use a lot of those components, and we can do that as well on the web channel for desktop web. We also have the ability of support for wearables, giving you the really access to a true omni-channel experience. That brings us into our API management feature overview. API management is one of the areas where we have heavily invested in, and we've made exciting improvements. Here we have our API Administrator console, and this is just a brief screenshot. We're going to go into it so you can see and get more details. we have improved the way the services are designed and the way you implement the business logic. We also added support for throttling. You can do global throttle for specific APIs, or you can make it apply to a specific IP address. So if you want to start monetizing the APIs you have, maybe you have data that's valuable to somebody in the industry, you can then expose those through Kony Fabric in a secure, standard way and let those users of those APIs and leverage it in a way that it's controlled, that's throttled, that it's based on usage, and then you can use the analytic and reporting engine part of that, of Kony Fabric, to define the billing and all those aspects of that engagement. And managing API versions and documenting the APIs, and we've made improvements around that, and also giving you an API proxy capability so you can really integrate to a virtually unlimited number of backend systems that are available out there. We added OAuth 2 provider capabilities to Kony Fabric itself. We did have an OAuth adapter, identity adapter before, but now you can use Kony Fabric as your custom OAuth provider. So you don't have to, for example, rely on, say, Google, right, to do the custom OAuth provider, being the custom OAuth provider, or Facebook, or whichever other third-party service or software that you may be using for identity management to become that OAuth provider. Kony Fabric now can act as that, give you full configuration of the grant types that you can select. How long do you want those tokens to live? And supporting versioning as well. If you have different versions of it, maybe you want one to connect to Active Directory and turn your Active Directory into an OAuth type of authentication system. Or you can use maybe some database where you have user credential information stored, and then you want to expose that database as an OAuth provider. And Kony Fabric can help you with that. We have the ability now to configure multiple developer portals. You can customize them, you can brand them, you can choose what parts you want to expose, what apps you want to include. You can also define what level of access the users have to see that information. And we'll see that in a moment in the recording as well, that will show you how the API management developer portal works. One of the biggest advantages is that we create these portals dynamically based on the open API files or the Swagger files that are defining what those services look like. So these portals are always up to date when a developer goes and works on that portal to try to understand how an API works. It is exactly the way it's working in production. There's no difference, and there's not a chance for that information to be stale and inaccurate. You'll know also that we have had analytics for a while, and a lot of the reports that are created automatically out of the box. And as we saw earlier, the health checks is one of the new features that we've added, and it allows you then to start keeping track of the performance and the health check and the status of your services. That way you don't have to necessarily log into the console and see, do I have any errors? You can get a proactive notification that tells you something is happening, and then you can go and take action. So now let's go ahead and show you an example of the OAuth service that I mentioned, how you can turn Kony Fabric as your OAuth provider. We're going to define an Active Directory-based identity service. It's going to be an LDAP-based web service, identity service. We provide all the configuration information that's necessary there, the URL, the domain, and then we save that. We can test it first and make sure that it's working. So it's good practice to do so. When we select sign in, then we'll get the response back. We see the identity response came back from Active Directory successfully. So now we save this identity service. And now we can configure a new one. And this one is going to be the OAuth version that is using that employee Active Directory service as the actual authentication mechanism. So we select the source in the configuration to define a token, until list. Here we have the ability also to define your own logo, customize what the screen looks like when it pops up to the user. So you have full control of that, changing the label, and even whether you want to redirect to a URL, where do you want that to redirect. So all of it, all the aspects of the custom OAuth is configurable. So now we're going to put it all together here, and we're going to go into the objects. Remember, in the previous examples where we built this integration services connecting to the database that provided employee information. Now we're going to select use the existing OAuth employee active directory identity service in order to be able to make these calls, the service calls. So we save that setting, publish it to the runtime, and once it's published, which, by the way, takes only a few seconds typically, it's deploying to the runtime environment. You get the updates here on the bottom screen that tells you everything that's happening, and should there be any errors, you'll get all the information there as well that helps you troubleshoot. Then you go to the developer portal, and notice how here now we have our developer portal where we can edit, we can change the branding, change the color, add the different apps that we want to be exposed and be part of that. And once we have configured that, then we can manage the pages that we want to include in there. If you want to include, for example, the home page, which will a standard page that will guide the developer through what's available here from an API perspective, you can also create new and add your own pages. So it does not have to be only the content that gets generated here automatically, but if you wanted to include specific information within your enterprise for developers to be aware, you can include that in this developer portal as well. So here are the pages. So now let's go ahead and take a look what that portal looks like. The URL to the portal is right there. And as you can see, it's very complete. You can have the getting started section. You have the specific API information, like what are the keywords, the secret, where do you connect to that. Here's the employee directory example with the base URL and all the services that are exposed and the different verbs that you can use, right? Like in this case, get employees, and you can test this. Now remember, we tied this to the Active Directory custom OAuth provider. So we can test it now. We can do a client ID, we provide the client ID and client secret, which is part of our Kony Fabric, which is something we get when we publish it into the runtime environment. That's how we know that the client that's making this call is a valid client. It's not some rogue app that's trying to access our backend system. So we sign, and we get the response back from Active Directory saying yes, this user is authorized, and now we can go ahead and start testing the services. We'll go ahead and define here an example. In this case, we're going to filter by an email address, so we can test it. We put in the filter information, and we can either cancel if we don't want to execute it there, or we can execute and get the response back. Now we see the response body, we see the full curl response as well, and then we see the contents that came back. So this really helps developers leverage those services that you have configured in Kony Fabric in a way that is secure and in a way that is standard. And the next section where we have improvements is around the continuous integration and continuous deployment and automated testing section. This is all part of the DevOps process. We have an offering called Kony AppFactory, and a lot of the enhancements that have gone into this around the DevOps processes align with the Kony AppFactory approach. This is when you're building multiple apps at scale. You want to make sure you have as much of an automated process end to end. So you're more focused on the developing and creating those apps and not necessarily on the operational aspect of how do I get this from beginning to end. So we have a source control repository. We have standardized an OEM on GitHub. And this is more of a process, people, and technology type of approach. For those who are wondering, what is a Kony AppFactory? We've never really heard of it before. And these are the tools that you see here that if Kony was to show up at your door and implement this for you in a greenfield scenario where you don't have any tools, these are the ones that we would implement. However, you may already be using Team Foundation Server, you may be using Subversion, you may be using different types of source control tools or build tools. We can plug those into this framework as well. Okay, so let's walk you through the scenario of how does this work end to end. Well, first the user checks in the project into the source control repository, in this case GitHub, and then the continuous integration builders will schedule those builds, and you can schedule those to run every 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, maybe once a week, once all the commits have gone in. But a lot of it is part of the process that you establish as part of your release cycle. And then the user can also manually log in and execute that build. Once the build is complete, and again for the automation for builds we use Jenkins, you can build your binaries or you can build your web apps or executables in the terms of Windows kiosk type of applications. And all of those builds can run in parallel. So you don't have to be waiting for one to finish. All the different binaries will be ready as soon as possible. Once the build is complete, then the user can get an email, and that user could be a tester, right? And then you can see, or a developer, and then they'll see the results of the build. If there's any errors, they can go back and figure out why the build failed, or if everything is fine, then they'll get a confirmation of a successful build. And then the next step is to deploy the runtime services. Everything that we just saw examples of in Kony Fabric and publishing those configurations into the runtime environment get published into the runtime environment through our command line interface. And then now we can test all these services, test the client side, and we do use Appium type of Appium test scripts to test on the AWS device farm. This is automated testing, and we're leveraging the AWS device farm to test across a number of different devices. Once the test is complete, then the user, whether that's a tester or developer, then gets the notification of the test complete and the results from that. At that point, then you're ready to deploy either to an internal app store, private app store, or to the public app store. Or if it's a web application, to Kony Fabric to run and be accessible through a browser. So this shows you the complete cycle from beginning to end and how we support that. For source code management, as I mentioned, GitHub was our choice for OEM. We can work with whatever you need, your tools you're working with. However, if you would like us to assist you implementing an AppFactory DevOps. And we also have a continuous integration dashboard that is part of the AppFactory console. This is the console where you manage everything about that CI/CD process. And we have made it look like Jenkins on purpose, right? That way, a lot of developers are already familiar with that look and feel, and they feel at home, and everything makes sense. So here you can configure your builds, you can schedule them, you can select maybe you want to do it every commit. You have a wide variety of configurable options. You can monitor the build progress. You can see here, for example, how long the builds are taking and when was the last time the build was completed. If there were any errors, you can get a notification. Then you also get a link to test the build, the binary, just download directly to your device so you can test it once the build is complete. And that automated testing is also linked to the AWS farm, which is the device farm that provides access to a wide variety of devices that you can test in. And there you can see an example of a report or a test job. Here you can see the status of the test. You can see what scripts were tested, in this case, the different XML outputs or server outputs that were expected, and you can see the status of those tests. You can also see them in the testing services section of the AppFactory tab within the Kony Cloud Console. When you do have an AppFactory enabled, you'll be able to access all these different settings and these different services that are tied to continuous integration in order to run your development shop as an AppFactory and be very efficient. With that, I want to thank everybody for your attention. That brings us to the conclusion of an overview of the V8 Kony version 8 features. We invite you to always follow us on Basecamp. Go out there, post any questions you may have, participate in the community forum, or you can also visit our website in Kony Fabric and Kony Visualizer product section and learn what's new, as we're constantly improving the platform. And we'll, as always, we'll like to hear your feedback. Now we have about 4 minutes, and we can open it up for questions, should there be any.
Thank you so much, Louis, for your session. I hope this is valuable for all of us. We really enjoyed. We still have a couple more questions there. I think Faizan has responded to most of them. I think it's just 1 or 2 left. Faizan, do you want to speak up on anything? Any questions that you want to share on this call?
Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, then we'll invite you, everybody, to do participate in the Basecamp forum. Maybe a question comes up later. Please feel free to post a question there. And we have hundreds of people who are looking at it every day, and we'll be happy to answer your question as well.
We have 3 questions on Fabric specifically, and let me read them out, and then maybe you can answer those, and then if we need to take some of them to Basecamp, we'll do that, or if we or we will answer some of them here as well. So let's look at the questions that are pending to be answered. I've answered most of them. So we have 3 that are pending. The first one is, if we have a web service with an authentication, can we create an OAuth in Kony Fabric?
The answer is yes. You can have that service, and if you have an integration service and an identity service, what you would have to do is define it as an identity service. And if one of the adapters that are available there, if it's not necessarily like an Active Directory type of adapter or a SAML type of adapter, then you also have the ability to do a custom identity adapter, and then you can connect that to your service and use that as the custom OAuth provider.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question is, do you have integration with testers like IBM, Rational, Test Workbench?
The way we integrate with those type of solutions is, and remember as I went through the development cycle process, it is all an automated process using standard tools like Jenkins, like Ant behind the scenes to do a lot of the packaging, the resources, a Gradle for Android, for example. And so as long as those tools allow us to take that binary that gets built from Kony Visualizer and drop it somewhere in a shared file or in a shared workspace where the tool can pick up the binary to run the test or install or automatically automate, right, that process of installing it on the devices, then yes, then we can certainly integrate with those.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question that we have pending here is, the question is the testing AWS form available if Kony Enterprise is installed on-prem? I think the question is more or less, is the Kony AppFactory available on-prem?
Yes, it is. Now, there's a component, like all your data, usually our customers that have an on-prem installation is because they don't want their information, their data to leave their enterprise, right, their network. There's a cloud component to the AppFactory, And all that cloud component does is all around the configurations and running the build. So in short, the answer is you can have it on-premise. We do support on-premise for AppFactory, but there will be one component that will always run on the cloud, that it's not a component that will expose any of your information. So it's not something you have to worry about from that perspective.
Okay, back to Tanmay. I think that's all the questions we had today.
There's one more question I think somebody posted on chat, is about currently we do not have multiple version supports using Kony Sync framework. If we are changing anything DO schema, is there any improvements in V8? That's the question, yeah.
Let me make sure I understand the questions. If there are any improvements in regards to when you change the schema on a sync implementation?
Yeah, let me just read out again.
Okay, yes, I think I see that he replied that yes. And the way that works, there's no changes in the way that works. We do have an offline object framework now, which I invite you to go and learn more about. We'll be happy to connect with you as well on that. Yeah, but the reason why that has not changed is because whenever the schema changes, the sync configuration gets created, and a lot of the code that Chris generated behind the scenes, it's considering that schema in order to synchronize based on a specific, for example, the timestamp, right? I'm going to synchronize based on the timestamp. That's going to tell me that which record it's the latest. So whenever you change the schema, a lot of that code that handles all of that processing and needs to be regenerated. And in order to maintain the relational integrity of the information that is being synchronized, that is the best approach. That's why it hasn't changed in the approach that works in version 8. But that's not to say that there's not a way to handle that, which you could dynamically load the schema and run the same scripts that create the database and that create the sync code separately. And it would just be a little bit more of a complex solution than you probably want to deal with.
All right, I think with that we have answered all the questions. We don't have anything pending. Once again, thank you, Faizan, and thank you, Luis, for doing this. We really appreciate your valuable time, and I think it's equally valuable for all of us, for all the rest of the community that we have here. If you guys still have questions, you can go to basecamp.kony.com. We have forums, that section available. You can post your questions, and you will get answers there as well. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. We have the next one coming up. You can go to the chat column and you can see the next one. Let me also share the slide which talks about the next webinar. And if you have any suggestions, any topic suggestions that you have, or any suggestions for that matter, you can email to basecamp@kony.com. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.